Hi, everyone. So my name is Chloe De Los Reyes, and I'm an assistant professor of English at Crafton Hills College. Please feel free to reach out to me via email. If you have any questions about my presentation today, I'm happy to chat with you. So I initially thought I was going to mostly discuss the specific changes I made in my welcome letter. However, as I began to work on this presentation and as I talked through my project with Lauren Service, it became clear to me that this presentation is my attempt at what Bell Hooks calls radical openness. As I share with you my journey in embodying self-reflective critical pedagogy to honor both my students and my commitments. My hope is that sharing my reflections and my experiences can offer you ways of rethinking your own welcome letters, your curricula, or your views, especially during these extraordinary times, for a lack of a better word. So I thought I'd begin by telling you a little bit about what informs my views and my work. My family moved to the United States when I was 13. And upon arriving here, I was introduced to the label ESL. And that particular action really stuck with me. In fact, this experience led me to English studies, where I eventually settled in composition studies and had a special interest in multilingual writing. It continues to shape and inform my work, my views about teaching and my learning as well. And also a big part of my training and my approaches stems from having worked as a writing center tutor. So upon graduating, I continued to work with people who share similar backgrounds to mine, and I spent the last 9 years of my teaching career as an adjunct at CSUSB. Recently, however, I made a few shifts. I moved from the role of adjunct to a full-time tenure-track professor, and then I transitioned from a four-year university to a community college. And just as important to note are my commitments. So for the last 3 years or so, I've been working closely with Beth Godby, who is an educator, who's an ex-professor, which is kind of funny, I think, and an activist who runs a website called Heart, Head, and Hands. Beth is so good at reminding me to think about what is important to me as I navigate academia or higher ed and just the world in general. And my commitments always change and get reevaluated, but some of my current ones include staying current and engaging with my discipline scholarship, always practicing reflection and research, honoring student lives and experiences, and staying curious. And so when I began my first year as a full-timer at Crafton Hills in fall of 2019, I brought with me a set of values and biases about education, about learning, about language, and some of which remain unexamined until I made this transition. For instance, both my experiences as an ESL and my studies in composition and multilingualism, or I believe also translingualism, helped me see difference in language not as a barrier to overcome or as a problem to manage, but as a resource for producing meaning in writing, speaking, reading, and listening. When I first arrived in the US, I always felt deficient because the label ESL made me deficient. There's a lot of stigma tied to it. But my experiences and my readings over the years has allowed me to see otherwise. Also, both my experiences as a writing center tutor and my interest in writing center studies have helped me find value in collaboration. And I think most importantly has allowed me to interrogate the meaning of expertise. I worked under a mentor who reminded me that we all bring something to the table, that I may have training in writing, however, my students have a wealth of knowledge that inform their writing. Bell Hooks, whom I will quote a lot from today, said that there must be an ongoing recognition that everyone influences the classroom dynamic, that everyone contributes. These contributions are resources. Used constructively, they enhance the capacity of any class to create an open learning community. Often before this process can begin, there has to be some deconstruction of the traditional notion that only the professor is responsible for classroom dynamics. It's not always perfect, of course. I wield my power every once in a while, right? And sometimes I'm not happy with it, but I try to be mindful of this at least. And lastly, my commitment to staying current through research and professional development continues to play a role in my academic or professional career. Of course, I also brought with me the not so good stuff. Even though I practiced reflection, I spent way too many years in one particular institutional context, so I just wasn't exposed to any other educational environments. My work with, and therefore my understanding of diversity, was limited, particularly as they relate to a wide range of student demographic. So even though I taught multilingual sections of writing and I worked with students from various cultural and socioeconomic backgrounds, I worked with first-gen students who shared similar backgrounds to mine. Nevertheless, it wasn't until I arrived at Crafton where I became exposed to an even more diverse group of learners. At Crafton, I had students who were older than me, who were returning students who were looking to find a second career. Some students didn't have plans to transfer to a four-year university. Some of them just want to transition directly into the workforce. It's also worth mentioning that I also had apprehensions about online education. I'm not sure where I picked this up, but I think I was surrounded by folks who didn't buy into this modality, and I somehow imbibed it. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list. I have lots and lots of weaknesses, but these two, I think, speak directly to what I will talk about today. So Howard Tinberg, a prominent compositionist who also teaches in a two-year college, in his interview in Pedagogue, believes that as teachers, we have no choice but to reflect on our teaching if we want to improve it. If we want to continue to learn our craft and to be able to make our courses interesting to our students and stimulating, we need to innovate as best we can. But it's a scary thing to do that. It means essentially subjecting your teaching on an ongoing basis to research and to reflection. So when I began my first semester at Crafton Hills in this new role, I was really scared. However, if I needed to stay true to my commitments, I needed to lean in, to borrow Lauren's words, actually. I spent my first semester reflecting and doing as much research and learning as possible. In fact, Beth Godby again advised me to imagine my first year as a first chapter to a book, where I tried to learn the setting, to understand my context, and to get to know folks and build relationships. Most importantly, I also looked for places where my values aligned or diverged from my old views and experiences, and I gave myself permission to experience new things and to evolve. And so began my journey in rethinking my approaches, my views, and my curriculum. I continued to do professional development. I even decided to get a DE certification, even though I was apprehensive about it. I also sought faculty professional learning communities so I can be surrounded by others who share same commitments or similar commitments to me, and also from folks who I can really learn from. I was brand new in this space. And I tried very hard to approach things with curiosity, right? Sometimes I just feel like I don't want to try it because it's new, but I needed to just do it. And so at the beginning of my second semester, I started to feel more settled and kind of grounded a little bit more. But of course, that feeling was only temporary. In March, COVID-19 hit and all of us were ushered into emergency remote learning. Like many of us here, the shift online also left me feeling shaky. And I was telling Lauren earlier that I remember just wanting to cry. And maybe I did just a little bit, but I haven't really had the chance to do so because I just needed to get things up and running and going, right? Of course, also later in May, we witnessed the murder of George Floyd, which sparked a movement. And actually this is difficult to me because especially with the Breonna Taylor news that happened last night, but these two things has really made me become more determined to really be more, to do things, to do and not just to read about things, rather, to put things into action. At any rate, both COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement and the ensuing fallout have exposed not only the limitations, but the underlying defects in both the US educational system and the country as a whole. We were all forced to shift our courses and pedagogies to better suit the shifting circumstances with little to no preparation. And on top of that, we've also had to reckon with the inequities and injustices to which many of us are complicit. And also, by the way, during this time, I don't know if you noticed my little parentheses. I know that I wrote down I became DE certified, and it seems so insignificant compared to the two events that I just talked about, but I promise it will make sense hopefully later on. So at the end of my first year in my new role and in my new institution, I was faced with the following questions. How can I translate my face-to-face pedagogy into an online or remote learning? How can I revise my current pedagogy so it honors my students? How can I revise my current pedagogy so I honor my commitments? How can I rethink my views and my approaches with the pandemic, racial injustices and general unrest, and the current US socio-political climate in mind? And as you may have noticed, I had more questions than answers than ever before. And it seemed really daunting at first, but my experience in research tells me that this could be a sweet spot, right? In fact, Alison Witt in Bad Ideas About Writing writes that designing and pursuing genuine research projects that generate rather than simply locate information teaches us that research is about innovation, about doing what hasn't been done before. It also demonstrates to us that research is a useful tool not only for learning, but also for action. So perhaps I was trying to just grasp something, but I tried to approach this as a really big research project. So instead of taking a break like many of you, I went to work over the summer. I spent the summer reading all that I can about online learning, and I also registered for the Equity 101 course where I became reacquainted with critical race theory, critical pedagogy, multicultural education, and all the good stuff. But most importantly, the course offered me opportunities to audit and reflect on my own experiences. Also, I got to know folks who are doing the same work as me, which is important. Community has become even more important to me these days. And as the course was winding down, I was faced with the following questions. How can I combine what I learned from my DE and my Equity 101 courses? How can I turn these best practices into critical practices? At some point over the summer, I came across critical digital pedagogy and read Jesse Stommel's piece entitled If Bell Hooks Made an LMS, Grades, Radical Openness, and Domain of One's Own. In it, Stommel argues that most teaching practice is unexamined because teachers in higher education are rarely asked to think critically about pedagogy. They structure learning as though students are interchangeable. They expect content mastery. They demand compliance with course policies. They wield expertise like a weapon. They grade because they never thought not to. They never had a reason not to. Because the problem is not individual teachers. The problem is systemic. We build systems that reflect our values, and that's what LMS makers have done. The last sentence struck a chord with me, particularly because as much as I love Canvas, I'd love to be able to make Canvas reflect my values as an educator, not just some place where I plug things in. Jesse Stommel's quote, coupled by Bell Hooks in choosing the margin as a space of radical openness, helped me proceed a little bit more. Hooks writes, spaces can be real and imagined. Spaces can tell stories and unfold histories. Spaces can be interrupted, appropriated, and transformed through artistic and literary practice. So my series of questions came down to this one question: how can I reimagine, appropriate, interrupt these spaces, meaning Canvas, Zoom, etc., so they best reflect what I hope to accomplish with my students? And I needed to start somewhere. And as part of the DE certification course, we were asked to write a welcome letter to kind of help us get going for our future class, which was, I thought, very helpful. But I remember auditing it for Equity 101 and thinking, it has all of the generic best practices features of a welcome letter. It has the course introduction, it has my contact information, it tells students what materials they need or how to access the course, and even how to get tech help. But these best practices or features no longer seem enough in light of what's going on around us and what I'd like to accomplish. So I went to work and I started to revise my welcome letter. I reminded myself that research and reflection not just replication is something that I'm working towards. And I had to ask myself, what kinds of classes do I want to create? What do I want to accomplish? And what's important to me? So I boiled it down to these 6, at least I think. Connection and community is important to me. Collaboration with my students is important to me, even more so now. Authenticity and transparency. Again, bell hooks. In talking about taking risk and sharing power, said that in my classrooms, I do not expect students to take any risks that I would not take, to share in any way that I would not share. So I have to share with them, most of the time when I'm feeling uncertain about an assignment or how to proceed. And actually, students bring with them, they help me troubleshoot. And we, as a class, come up with ways to fix things or how to proceed with an assignment, for example. And also my background in writing center studies tells me that context is important. So I needed to think about what is currently happening and who are Crafton students and what my purposes are again. And then of course, language and tone are important too, especially with, I guess I was trained to think that language holds meaning or create meaning, right? So that's something that I carry with me all the time. So it took some time to point out, it took some time to figure this out, but I settled on the following changes. And there's more, of course, but these are the ones I think that are most salient. I decided to include an acknowledgement of what's going on around us in my welcome letter, a plan of how we are going to do this as a class and why, so an explanation for my decisions, an invitation to help me think through the course together through feedback. And I came across this article by Anne-Marie Womack entitled Teaching is Accommodation, Universally Designing Composition Classrooms and Syllabi. In it, she talks about warm and inviting language versus commanding and cold language. So I tried as best as I can to go through and say things like, I hope, I invite, I encourage, versus you need to do this, you have to do this, et cetera, et cetera. And also, I like to say we because I am doing things with them as well, as opposed to you need to do this. So that's, I think, a minor shift, but it could be, I think, very helpful for students. I read another piece and I can't locate the resource, the importance of calling maybe our office hours into student hours to highlight the fact that these are for our students. And at the end, a request to be patient with ourselves and with one another. I think I needed to really own up to the fact that as much as I think, I've done all kinds of professional development, there's so many different things that I still haven't figured out. And I'm learning Canvas as I'm going along. And by the way, at the end of the presentation, I will post links to the different versions of my welcome letter as well. It's just I didn't think of this before I started my presentation, so I apologize. I also want to point out that in sharing my revised welcome letter, I was looking at it this week. I fought the urge to make changes in order to make my document really align with what I'm talking about today. I looked at it last week and I was like, oh my God, it seemed like so different from my views now, right? And, but I told myself if I really want to practice radical openness, right, I needed to share with you all where I was at a few weeks ago, where I'm at now, and also to make a point about how this is, or I am, we're all still a work in progress, that we are this, and I said, this is, we are, I am not perfect, and that this is hard, like no joke, I am like exhausted all the time, and that we are doing our best. But most importantly, I want to highlight or amplify the need for us to be willing to reflect, to research, and to revise our practices, our curricula, and our views as necessary. I find myself changing my views on a regular basis now with all of the things that's happening, right? And I think that the process by which we are all going through is in fact part of our work and part of what embodying critical pedagogy means, right? And I'd like to end by reading one of my reflections from Equity 101. This is in response to Giroux's chapter, Rethinking the Language of Schooling, from Teacher as Intellectuals. I said, this chapter made me think about the connections between theory and practice, especially as they relate to critical pedagogy. And I keep coming back to the idea that critical pedagogy is complex and nuanced and thus cannot be reduced to just a set of practices or methodologies, although practices and methodologies are important parts of it. In fact, for me, critical pedagogy is more of a stance, a set of beliefs or worldview that shapes our actions and our ways of operating. We don't just perform critical pedagogy, we must embody it. When we adopt a critical pedagogical stance, we must also always question how our actions contribute to the oppressive systems we are trying to dismantle. It's a constant learning and unlearning and relearning and revising of the very things like methods and practices we think are helpful. In fact, I am struck by the title, Rethinking the Language of Schooling, because again, for someone who looks at language, it suggests a shift in thinking and not just an adoption of method. And thank you very much. I have resources for you as well in the chat in a little bit.